Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Charlie Nicklin. I'm the Chief Executive of IAgrE, and I'd like to thank you all for joining our October presentation. I'd like to welcome Mark Kibblewhite for our lecture today. Mark has a long association with IAgrE. He's a chartered environmentalist, a fellow, and also a past president. Mark was previously the director of the National Soil Resources Institute at Cranfield University, where he is now an Emeritus Professor. Mark is also the current chair of the Dorset Wildlife Trust. In today's lecture, Mark is going to navigate us through the various rewilding projects in and around Dorset and look at the various different technical challenges and commercial opportunities there are for agricultural engineers. Just before Mark starts, you're all currently muted. And if you'd like to ask a question, then please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll unmute you so you can ask in person. Okay, I'll now hand over to Mark.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much to colleagues at IAgrE for the opportunity to do this presentation. Now, I need to say up front that I'm not really an equipment specialist, so I'm going to say quite a bit about opportunities for equipment, but at a rather high level, so please forgive me for not being an equipment specialist. Hopefully you'll, at the end of it, think that I know something about wilding. So I'm going to focus on wilder projects rather than specific wilding ones, because I think that that will give everybody a better breadth of the types of activities that are taking place across UK, and therefore the opportunities for agricultural engineers and others. And I'm going to focus also on Dorset, mainly because I know it really well, and I know what's going on across the county, but also because I think that's also a way of making sure that the breadth of opportunities that are out there are illustrated in the talk, rather than perhaps focusing on one or two very well-known and prestigious national projects. And it'll also give you a chance to have a little look on our beautiful county. Okay, so what I'm going to do is give you some context. Why is all this wilding activity happening? Point out that wilding has many meanings for different people and try and identify what those might be, so you can navigate your way through different projects which describe themselves as wilding but are actually very different to each other. I've got some case studies. I want to look at the controlling factors on the wilding process, or the ecological succession process. And forgive me, I think this counts as CPD, so I'm going to do a little bit of theory at that stage. Then we'll have a look and see where AgEng can really contribute. And I'm absolutely convinced there are really big opportunities for AgEng in this sector. So let's go for it. Oh, on the right there is a soil map. As you know, I'm a soil scientist. This is a soil map that was made in the 1930s of Dorset. I think it's handy for the presentation because it shows all the different types of soils that occur in the county. They're very varied, and as a consequence, so is the habitat quality. Anyway, let's move on to the first thing, which is the context. Well, the big context for everything, I believe, is climate change and biodiversity loss. Interestingly, the data you can see, you probably had a quick look at it already, for Herne Airport at Bournemouth shows that there's been quite a clear uplift in the mean April temperatures from 8.2 to 9.2, comparing the years from 61 to 90 to those from 91 to 2020. I mean, that is quite a lift in the April mean temperature. And obviously, that also shows us something about the length of the growing season. So climate change is with us in Dorset, as it is everywhere else. The rate of biodiversity loss in Dorset is quite worrying, to say the least. We've got about 3,000 species, which in one way or another identified at being at some risk. Some are protected, some are rare or scarce. We've lost about half our bee species and about 40% of our butterflies. So again, biodiversity loss is a real issue in Dorset. So these two big things, climate change and biodiversity loss, are really the overarching concerns and context in which people are thinking about wilding or wilder processes. But I don't think that's the real driver. I think the real driver is, as always, economics. And the situation for us in Dorset is intriguing because whereas the agricultural sector is worth about 300 million, it's estimated that the gross value added for environment-related activities, and bear in mind we've got a wonderful coastline, so there's a huge tourism that's related to the marine environment. We're not just talking about terrestrial environment here, but it comes to about 1.5 billion of gross value added per annum. So in the context of our county, Dorset, the environment's a big deal as far as the economy goes, perhaps more than it is in others. And some studies have been done to see what would be the effect of moving some land from agriculture into higher value natural habit or semi-natural habitats. And that does demonstrate that we would get an uplift in the economy and an uplift in jobs. So I think the main driver for all this is, interestingly, not climate change and biodiversity loss, but the economic self-interest of individuals and of the county. Actually, to achieve these changes costs a great deal. Based on what we've been doing in the Wildlife Trust, I reckon it costs about £20,000 to buy a hectare of land in Dorset and then do the work you need to do initially to move it from agriculture into a biodiversity gain option. That is a substantial amount of capital. And of course, there's a maintenance cost that comes afterwards. And that's the reason why I wanted to do this presentation, because I think we have an opportunity as ag engineers to make that whole process a lot more efficient. Okay, let's go on now to wilding has many meanings. Oh, by the way, on the right there, I hope you can see it. Beautiful late spring woodland in West Dorset. Semi-natural environment. A little bit of management takes place. There is a little bit of grazing. Sheep go into this wood. There's also obviously a lot of deer going into the wood, but it's more or less about as natural habitat as you would get in West Dorset. So there are all sorts of different ideas about wilding and what it is. The purest view would be that it's a process where you let nature determine the direction of the habitat trajectory. You don't intervene really in any meaningful way at all, and you allow habitat to develop without human intervention. But actually in this talk, I'm going to talk about a range of projects, and I prefer to use the process that we're making, the definition that these are wilder landscapes or wilder projects rather than wilding projects. All of them have lots of opportunities for ag eng. So let's move and have a focus on Dorset. Actually, we don't have any really big, true wilding projects. Like, for example, those in Scotland where I am today, you know, thousands of hectares. The largest in Dorset is one Wildlife Trust has, about 200 hectares of agricultural land going into a wilder state. But we have many thousands of hectares across the county that are managed as wilder landscapes. And that's what I'm going to tell you something about in a moment or two. Some of the sites are really quite large, maybe 1,000 acres or more. Some are clusters of habitats over quite a large area, many square kilometers, a lot of very small, isolated nature reserves. I'll just take you around the slide here if I can. I'm a bit concerned you might not be able to see the slides on the right, but let's have a look on, whoops, let's go back one. On the top left, we've got a beautiful hedgerow in sort of May time. The west of the county is full of these beautiful hedgerows, hugely rich in biodiversity. Below that, a patch of wild daffodils at a secret spot, for obvious reasons, in the Marshwood Vale. Over to the right, can you see that? I hope you can. I'm going to get rid of it anyway so I can see it. On the top right, part of the Kinkham National Nature Reserve, beautiful part of the upper catchment of the Hook River that drains down into Poole Harbour. And then down on the right, a small nature reserve, permanent grassland, and beautiful yellow meadow ant hills. So this is sort of background wilding, which is not really being managed as such for wilding, but illustrates the sort of nature of the county for you. Okay, let's have a look at some theory now. I'm going to read through the many words at the bottom of the slide, because I think these words, which are now really old, I mean, 50 years old, beautifully summarize how ecological succession works. So here goes. Ecological succession is an orderly process of community development. That's the community of the biota, of course. That is reasonably directional. In other words, it doesn't go in an exact way forward. The trajectory isn't precise, but it's reasonably directional. And therefore, it's predictable. The ecological succession results from modification of the physical environment by the community. That is, succession is community controlled. That is, the living part of the living community controls its own trajectory, even though the physical environment determines the pattern, the rate of change, and often sets the limits as to how far the development can go. So, in other words, depending on the physical environment, where the ecological succession will tend to go is controlled in terms of the pattern of change by the physical environment. Really important for us as IAgrE because obviously we're really good at managing the physical environment. Ecological succession culminates in a stabilized ecosystem in which maximum biomass or information content, really interesting that, but as the succession progresses, the amount of information that's contained in the ecosystem increases. And ultimately, we get a symbiotic function between organisms that's maintained by energy flows, which the energy flows obviously comes from the capture of radiant energy in photosynthesis. So this is really the underlying process of wilding, or making things wilder. It's about managing the ecological succession. Let's have a quick look at the image on the left. So along the bottom, we've got time. So we're starting from a situation perhaps where there's no soil. It's just some as yet unvegetated land. Going right through to the far right, where we've perhaps arrived at a climax mature forest. And in that process, you can see that the productivity, that's the top line, increases rather rapidly in the early stages of the succession, and then it declines to a constant value. And in primary agriculture, we're interested in maintaining the maximum productivity. So generally, our temperate cereal production, for example, aims to control the succession to avoid further succession beyond the point where the productivity is highest. Whereas when we wild, we're going to progress beyond that and towards a final ecological succession. On the right is a kind of development from the image on the left, one that was developed by Steve Hobson, our very own Jim Harris, who is an IAgrE member. And in this, we can understand that there are two key barriers which will determine how far we get in the ecological succession. The first one's abiotic, so that is the physical environment, chemical environment, etc. And the second one is the biotic one. And I'm going to come back to these in some detail in a moment, because it's managing these barriers, the abiotic barrier and the biotic barrier, which is really at the heart of managing the ecological succession in a wilding process. Okay, I've got a few case studies here, and the reason I've got these really is to sort of illustrate how this successional process occurs in different types of wilder projects. On the top left, we've got an agricultural landscape, well, one that was agricultural until about a year ago. It's part of a 190-hectare nitrate offset project. So in the Poole Harbour catchment, something like £6,000 has to be paid into a fund every time a house is built. And that then creates a larger fund that is used for nitrate offset projects. And in this case, 190 hectares of land has been acquired and taken out of agriculture, so there's no nitrogen being applied. That project is fairly much a pure wilding project, because the management of it is going to simply be left to nature in most ways. There's some disruption, for example, to drainage, but otherwise it's pretty much a pure wilding project. If we move below that to the Great Heath project, which is a large dispersed project over about 600 acres of landscape, which is high value heathland, that is more a traditional conservation project. So in this case, the wilder process is in effect to contain the succession at the level it has reached over a long period of time under a particular type of management, so that the heathland ecological communities are retained and not lost by further succession. If we move to the bottom left-hand one, which is wet pasture in West Dorset, again, the purpose here is mainly to contain further succession so that we don't end up having encroaching scrub and woodland and losing the high value, particularly flora, that's in that wetland pasture. So again, what we're trying to do here is actually prevent any further wilding, keep the ecological succession at the stage it's at. Moving to the top right-hand one, there's a particularly interesting wilding project on the Mapperton estate, Luke Montague's management. By the way, you can see these beautiful park cattle in the background, and a lovely oak tree with a stag horn structure on it on the right. This is land that until very recently was used for grazing, and Luke tells me it was generating from the whole tenancy about £3,000 a year net. So his decision was to take it out of agricultural production, put it into a wilding project, and then develop ecotourism around it. But in some respects, it's not a true wilding project, because again, a lot of it is in triple SIs. And although there's going to be a succession beyond where it is currently on quite a lot of the land, that's going to be done by design. So there is actually a design of how that landscape will look in the future, and the succession is actually a managed one. So in some respects, it's not a true wilding project, because nature's being managed rather than nature being allowed to do its own thing. If we move below on the right, you can see the end of a fairly near natural succession following physical recovery of land after a quarrying operation. And that's sort of in between something which is very well managed and something which allows nature to do its own thing. And then on the bottom right, we've got something which is absolutely a planned, designed landscape, where a new road was built for the Olympics, the road down to Weymouth, Portland, and the chalk cutting has been managed beautifully, actually, and very successfully to create a wonderful flora. So what I've tried to do there is illustrate that actually there's a whole range of different types of wilder projects. Some are true wilding or near true wilding, like the one on the top left, and others are nothing like that really, because they're designed systems and managed to a particular endpoint, like the one on the bottom right. Okay, so going back to that idea of abiotic and biotic barriers, what controls the rate of change towards a later ecological state? What can we manage to make sure we arrive perhaps at the design that we're imagining we'll achieve? And we've got these two lists of abiotic and biotic processes, which you've probably all read now. So I'll just go around the images, and then we'll move on and see where the IAgrE input can be. By the way, on the left, I mean, these are examples of really commonplace soil management in West Dorset. On the top left, we've got quite serious erosion on the chalk tops. Below that, high sediment loading from the silty, sandy soils that prevail in the valleys. And at the bottom left, and a really appalling example of nutrient loss and pollution. So I just put those in really to illustrate that this isn't a pristine, beautifully managed agricultural landscape. And part of the motivation, no doubt, for some of these wilding projects from the general community is to move away from that kind of activity. On the right, I suppose I needed to include a picture of a beaver. Actually, in the Wildlife Trust, we have brought some beavers from where I am in Tayside down to Dorset, and they're doing really well. But for my mind, I mean, the beaver has an important part to play in the scheme of wildlife conservation. But I think in a very crowded landscape like Dorset, it's quite hard to imagine that beavers will be allowed to do their own thing, to go wild. They'll always be contained, I think, in one way or another. The bottom right one is really probably the most interesting image in my whole presentation, because this is a wilding outcome. So 30 years ago, this was a meadow, and it's been grazed lightly, and the scrub has moved in, and some trees have moved in. And the trees have actually been planted by jays, they're oak trees. So that gives us an idea of what some of the landscape that currently is in not very productive dairy production, for example, would look like in 30 years if we wild it. I'm not saying whether we should or we shouldn't. I'm just saying I think it would look a lot like that. Okay, so what's the AgEng opportunity? Well, there are a lot of them. To get the abiotic management right in the first place, when we perhaps take land from intensive agricultural production into a more wilder state, we most likely will have to do some land reprofiling. That might be quite extensive, or it might simply be just creating a less than smooth and perfect field surface. We might want to remove nutrients. As a soil scientist, I find it really hard to see why we would want to remove topsoil, but that is something that is often done. We might have to do with compaction management. We almost certainly will have to deal with some hydrology, drainage alteration, at least, maybe some wetland creation. So there's quite a lot on the abiotic side. These are all physical processes. Then on the biotic side, we may need to collect seed, plant seed. We may need to move plants, including trees, from one location to another. There are also things that we can do in relation to invertebrate and vertebrate introductions, not least fencing options. So a lot there. And going to the bottom right there, afterwards, there's a lot to be done to maintain whatever project we've set in place. So I've got a couple of examples now. I'm going to slow down a little bit. I think we've got enough time to slow a little bit and go through these in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the landscape on the left, this is a view from Egerton, looking out towards the sea. You can just about make out the sea above the land horizon. And in the distance, we can see Marshwood Vale, and this is the landscape of West Dorset. Lots of hedges, small irregular fields. It's been in dairy production for centuries. Indeed, the person sat on the machine in the middle is my grandfather, and I love the way he's got his hat hidden away in the machine and a tie on. I can't believe it was actually haymaking that day. I think he must have been sat on it for the photo. But the point of including him really is this picture was taken probably about 1925, 1930. And the fields would have then been full of wildflowers, and there would have been far more biodiversity than we have now. A lot of it has been lost. But we can't really seriously go back to managing it the way that my grandfather did. He had a lot of men working for him, and his productivity was very low compared to what we would achieve today. So the problem is, how do we manage this landscape, small irregular fields, primarily dairy production, certainly animals. Even if we don't have dairy, we're going to have cattle. How do we manage that in a way which is cost efficient and at the same time effective to manage biodiversity, such as we see in that lovely picture in the middle? Go down to the bottom right-hand corner, because to get that kind of biodiversity in a meadow, you need to apply a huge amount of spatial and temporal precision to the operations. My impression is that we haven't really captured that in the AgEng world yet, that there are real opportunities to understand how to have a cost-efficient way of managing meadows such as this for productivity and for habitat, particularly taking account of the need to be very exact in our timing and possibly very exact in managing different parts of even quite small fields in different ways. I think that's quite a challenge. Anyway, let's have a look. Field management obviously involves general things such as weather forecasting, and we've got quite a lot of skill for that already, although it's not integrated perhaps entirely into a sort of decision support process. We actually are fortunate these days to have pretty good weather forecasting. The haymaking, well, of course, we've got lots of tools for that. It's on the face of a very mature area. But my observation is that many of the machines and equipment that's being used in this landscape of small, irregular fields isn't really designed for that landscape. So maybe we need smaller, probably electrically driven machines. That I think is an opportunity for innovation, basically. A big problem separate from the field management itself is manure management, as it is for everyone else. For example, in the Wildlife Trust, we have a 900-acre farm. We have to maintain the habitat. We have to have a really large-ish herd of cattle relative to the land area that we've got. So we've got a huge problem with manure management and spreading. So all of the things that would apply in a conventional intensive dairy production are still applying in a less intensive habitat orientated system. And there's a lot of opportunity, I think, still to do that better. And then, of course, we move to the management of the animals. I've just mentioned some things like stock location, perimeter fencing. Well, I think that's pretty much done, isn't it? In the sense that I don't see much more than more efficient existing fencing processes being used, but you tell me differently. But certainly as far as managing stock within an area, already in Dorset, a lot of geofencing and virtual fencing is being used. Okay, so a few things there that relate to cost-efficient, low-intensity grassland management. And just to sum up the reason why I've included it, the reason is to maintain a landscape that's biodiverse and productive. Requires us to be able to, in a sense, do things in some ways in the way they were done 80, 90 years ago. But of course, we can't do them exactly that way because we could never find the labor or indeed the motivation to do it that way. So we need to find a more modern, innovative way of doing it. Okay, so moving on to this second case study. So this is accelerated wilding of former agricultural land. I'm not going to get too much into the debate about whether we should be wilding agricultural land, because agricultural land in the end feeds us. However, this particular example, the one that's on the map, sort of low grade 3 verging on 4 land that's being wilded. Well, for my money, this is the sort of land that should be moving into a more biodiverse, habitat orientated land management. Whereas the grade 1 and 2 land, and yes, we even have some of that in Dorset, really does need to be intensified, but I won't go into that too much just now, perhaps in the question session later. Lots of innovation is taking place in terms of plant production. Just a short distance from where I am near Dundee now, we've got vertical farming production of tree seedlings. So forest nurseries moving on to something really, really advanced technologically. The big opportunity, I think, is not so much actually in the water management, the land reprofiling, the nutrient management, or even the tree production, seed harvesting, or the plant translocation, although all these things do have great opportunities in them. I think the big and very interesting opportunity is in relation to monitoring, because certainly if any public money, what remains is used to support these wilding and habitat projects, we need to be able to, or it's necessary to demonstrate that they've actually achieved what they said they would achieve, which requires us to monitor the biodiversity that's developed or hasn't developed. Currently, this is pretty much entirely reliant on individuals going out and counting stuff. Like my brother-in-law on the bottom right there with his net looking for beetles. It's impossible to see how any large-scale habitat regeneration project, even in one county, can be supported for its monitoring by individuals who have the expertise. They simply aren't there. The productivity is not very great anyway, and the scale of the demand for the monitoring is going to be enormous. So I think this is a big opportunity for us to think about how we can, for example, count birds, count different types of birds, count insects, count different types of insects, so that in a cost-efficient and really quite comprehensive way, we can demonstrate that there has been some gain in biodiversity where public money is used. So I'm really asking people to think about what could be done. Please do contact me. I'm very interested to see whether there might be some projects that could be developed, not perhaps for myself, but more for the community. Okay, so I think I'm more or less on time. I'm going to try and sum up a bit here now. First of all, driven, I think, more by economics than actually sort of altruistic views of climate, critically important ambitions to deal with climate change and biodiversity loss. I think driven by economics, there is a large and growing wilding activity, which is important in relation to climate and ecological emergencies, but actually it's been driven by economic opportunities. When people talk about wilding, they mean a range of different things. Some people are thinking about the kind of pure wilding that's going on in the Highlands of Scotland, thousands of acres more or less, left to manage themselves, nature to manage itself. Others are thinking about really small scale habitat development, even with an exact idea of what kind of habitat will be preferred over another. So, important message from the little session today is that wilding covers a multitude of different things, but they all require, in one way or another, these abiotic and biotic barriers to be identified and overcome. And that's the IAgrE opportunity. How can we more efficiently and effectively address and overcome these different barriers? if we're going to make serious, rapid and efficient progress with dealing with the ecological emergency, with the loss of biodiversity, even if we can't bring all the species that are lost back, I don't think that's realistic, we still need to understand how we can increase the abundance of wildlife in the landscape. And if we're going to be successful with that, a lot of innovation is needed. And I believe there's a lot more scope for technology transfer from mainstream agriculture. So some of the things that are being developed or have been developed in mainstream agriculture are simply not yet being applied in the, for example, conservation sector. Lots of opportunity there. And just to sum up, I really am convinced agriculture engineering has a really critical role to play in advancing the scale and scope of these different types of wilding and the success of them. Okay, I think that'll do. I'm going to stop sharing and maybe we've got some questions in the chat.
Thanks, Mark. Absolutely fascinating that. Yeah, there's loads of questions. So first question, we'll dive straight in. Mike Whiting, you've got the first one.
Yeah, when we hear arable farmers talking, Mark, often they'll say they look at their yield from their combine yield map and they'll say, right, I've got half hectare in that corner of the field, bit down this corner of the field here that isn't productive. So is there any opportunities to run wilding alongside intensive agriculture, just thinking about, you know, obviously food production and what we're faced with in the future?
Absolutely, there is. First thing, we, you know, as I say, wilding covers a multitude of different ideas and opportunities. So even small areas like headlands, shaded areas and so on, these can be developed for biodiversity gain. And if there are enough of them across the landscape, then at a landscape scale, we're making a big difference and things will improve, even though we've got an intensive production going on inside that landscape. We can get the connectivity that's needed to, in effect, create a high value biodiversity landscape. So and let's be pragmatic about this. It's much more likely that those small areas are going to be found relatively quickly and easily than it is that, you know, come across 1,000 hectares of good agricultural land that nobody wants for food production. So yeah, answer is absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, second question from me. How do you draw the line or differentiate between a wilded area and, you know, pasture land that's just lightly grazed and has minimal sort of input?
Yeah, well, perhaps I haven't managed to get my idea across. I think there's a whole spectrum of stuff, from this almost sort of purist wilding idea that you fence a large area off and let nature do what it wants to do, and areas where you know, you go in and intensively manage to a designed endpoint. So a grazed pasture like those that occur in West Dorset, many of which do have minimal human input because there's not a lot going on, sits in that spectrum. So I don't think it's helpful to think this is wilding and this is not wilding.
Yeah.
I think it's much more important to think about the whole spectrum of opportunities to wilder things. In other words, to increase the habitat quality and get some biodiversity gain, than it is to be purist and say, well, we're only doing it one way, which is nature's way.
Okay.
That help?
Yeah, okay. Next question is from Mark Andrews. I think Mark's in a public area at the moment, so I'll ask the question for him. Is there enough technical data to support low inputs versus low outputs? And if yes, how is this being sold to the farming community?
I don't think there is enough data. I immediately start thinking of a couple of quite substantial farms actually more in North Dorset than West Dorset. Both of these are absolutely commercial operations. They're not, you know, wildlife trust stuff. They're there as businesses, and their primary output is food. In both cases, they're both pretty sophisticated managers, actually. In both cases, they have stepped back from high input to a lower input with a reduction in yield, but a very substantial increase in net margin. So quite apart from biodiversity gain and so on, in terms of trying to get a commercial a successful commercial outcome in some landscapes, I'm not saying in all, there's definitely a sense that dropping back a bit on the inputs should give you a higher net margin, even though your yields dropped. I don't think there's enough data out there, though, I'm not an agricultural economist, but my impression is there's not enough data out there to really give a lot of farmers confidence to do that, and also for them to know whether their land is of a kind where that will really work, or whether they ought to be really more focused on further intensification.
There might be a few that have tried it by backing off on fertiliser, given the cost of it this last year or so.
I'm sure of certainly people in Dorset have done it not out of choice but out of need.
Yeah. Next question is from Bob Pringle. Do you want to unmute yourself, Bob?
Hello. I was in West Wales and Mid Wales recently, and they had stunning 3.5 metre high hedges. And unlike hedges like that in Scotland, I couldn't see any flail marks and so on. It seemed to me that they've got a fantastic system for trimming the hedges, and I just wonder, anybody knows that what's the best type of way of doing this and what machines would be available?
Yeah. First thing, I'm pretty much convinced that in Dorset we wouldn't have the hedges we still have. Even on the chalk uplands, we've still got some hedges. We wouldn't have them at all without flail-based machines. They would have gone because there'd be no way they could be managed. So I actually think the bushwhacker approach, the flail approach, has actually helped us to maintain a lot of hedges which we would otherwise lose. Actually, Bob, a theme that I've had for a few years is, why do we always think about the machine that we need to manage a particular vegetation design? Why don't we think about altering vegetation design and the machine so we get a better option? The hedges that we have, some are obviously ancient, but a lot are not that old. And I think more is needed to think about how we design hedges so that particular machines work well with them, rather than saying, oh, well, we've got a machine here, we'll use it. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I take your point. I suspect the machine that we're using was a circular saw-based type of machine, but I don't know. And I'm desperate to find out.
Well, I'm in Scotland, so I'll look out next time in Wales.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Stuart. Oh, you want to mute yourself? That's if you're still on. I'm assuming you're still on. Actually, you might not be on. Looking at the list, you might have disappeared. So I'll tell you what, we'll just skip over and we come back to that at the end. Okay. Alan Plum, you've got two questions.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie, and hello again, Mark. I never lose an opportunity to promote the Douglas Bomford Trust, as you know,
good,
or health and safety, and there's a sort of broad link here. You'll remember in your time as a trustee, we were funding a PhD student at Liverpool, John Moores, on virtual fencing. And it's relevant to Bob's point and yours as well about the loss of hedgerows over the years. But in these bigger sort of wider open spaces to keep control, it seems there might be some opportunities there. And in the chat, I did ask for a bog off. So the first question that was directed at you, Mark, and the other one is addressed to everybody. Is anyone else aware of similar research, that doesn't involve physical fencing or electric fencing to control whether it's cattle, sheep, whatever, ranging around areas you don't want them in?
Yeah, we are using in the Wildlife Trust on some of our open areas on the Great Heath, for example, where we've got minimal amount of fencing, but we need to control the spatial and temporal precision of grazing. We are using virtual fencing.
Okay.
But I think it's first generation stuff. So the collars respond to a GPS position. Yeah.
What actually physically controls them then?
The thought that somewhere deep in their memory that something uncomfortable happened when they went.
And interestingly, I mean, that was the learning process, wasn't it, with the sound-based system? But yeah, it seemed to me it's got potential.
I mean, others may know more, but the problem in part is battery life. And also there are perhaps better ways to position the animals using triangulation and so on. So that I think what we've been using is really first generation, and maybe the second generation will have batteries as longer lives, better triangulation of positions and so on. But
the Liverpool work was using sound-based systems and identifying particular frequencies that they reacted to. So it's quite interesting. They would be easy to move around the environment.
That's right.
But it's one of these many PhD projects that sort of goes onto a virtual shelf these days and may not resurface. So I should keep reminding people of that one. I think it was interesting.
I'm sure others are aware of similar application, because certainly even in Dorset there's I could probably list half a dozen cases where people are using it. So it's moved from something a bit exotic and unproven into something which is in normal practical use, really.
And Charlie, you mentioned Stuart. If he has gone, he did respond to me and said they're using lasers to control deer. I was sort of visualizing that as a combined way of culling as well, maybe. But anyway, I suppose it depends on the strength of the laser. But it was an interesting opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, Ken Pollock, next question. Ken still...
Charlie, would you like to say it? I've got a poor signal.
Yeah, I think Ken's basically talking about the finance. So basically, low output ag is hard enough to make money with normal high tech farming. Where is the money going to come to pay for all this stuff?
Yeah, the example that I mentioned of the Mapperton estate is a particularly interesting one. They're interested in biodiversity gain, and but they're not idealistic. They're doing it because they think this is a better way to get a return for the estate than what they were doing previously. So in a landscape like I live in, there are thousands and thousands of tourists. Some of them are really quite wealthy. So if you want to go around Luke Montague's wilding experiment now, he'll fix you up with a £50 1 hour tour. And you can stay overnight in some purpose-built eco pods, which cost you really quite a big sum. So, but it'd be great value, of course. So the sources of income for this are not the same as they would be for intensive agriculture. I don't think in the long run the sources of income are public money either. I mean, we'll see over the next month or so what actually happens, but I think to have sustainable wilding or wilder projects, they've got to have an income source that's allows them to wash their face without public funding. So yeah, it's not really about thinking about how you could make enough conventional agricultural returns to make it pay. You're thinking about other income streams than food production, I think, which tells us also, by the way, that in a lot of places it wouldn't be appropriate to do other than continue and intensify food production.
Yeah, okay. The next one, Declan, really that's just making a point that BBC Springwatch is using AI and machine learning.
Yeah, there's some really good stuff actually, Charlie, that's being developed in the States by the ornithology community. So, you know, I was emphasizing the importance of monitoring, that there really is a huge gap. If we look around the planet, we can see people have obviously identified the gap and are trying to come up with machine, you know, with AI or other based techniques to, for example, analyze visual images or analyze sound profiles and so on. A lot of work happening at Cornell on the land. So there's some interesting stuff that's coming through. Yeah.
So yeah, keep an eye out for that program next week. Jane, you next question. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Good afternoon, Mark. How are you?
I'm pretty good today.
Excellent.
I like your soil map behind you.
Ta-da! Very good. Okay, so you know what question I'm going to ask. This kind of relates to elms and you know, the post-cap reform and what have you, which obviously is on hold at the moment. But I just have a question. Obviously, to achieve this change in land use, there are going to be costs associated with that. And I know you're putting that angle in terms of the agricultural engineering, the tools, the machinery, the technologies that we need to achieve this transition. And how do we reconcile that short-term cost with the long-term benefits that we're going to get? Especially that those costs are going to be met by a few, but the benefits are going to be enjoyed by many.
You won't be surprised, I think, Jane, to hear that I think that regulation is rather important. So what we've currently got, let's be frank, in agriculture is a lot of externality costs that aren't paid for by the sector, but are paid for by the wider community. Some of those are relate to biodiversity loss. There are others, like the soil-related ones, which are very large, much larger, actually. So in principle, we could imagine two ways to motivate change. One way would be to say, we'll pay you to do something different so that these externalities are at least contained. That, in essence, is what ELMS is about. We'll use public money to incentivize land managers to behave differently. I seriously wonder whether that is sustainable in the long term. It commits to long-term public funding. And if we look back over many schemes over the last decades, the transactional costs are huge for everybody. You know, the monitoring, etc., is very onerous in a lot of cases. So another way of doing it is to say, just as in any other sphere where there's an externality, part of the role of government and good governance is to control that externality so that one sector doesn't, if you like, freeload on all the other ones. That's what regulation is about. So I tend to think that we need more better regulation of land management than we've got currently, which I know will be very, very unpopular in the land management sector, but I actually think that would be more efficient for everybody. In the end, businesses need certainty, so we change the rules of the game, but nonetheless, there's a straightforward understanding what the rules are. We get on with them, rather than having very, very complex systems of incentivization that require huge transactional costs. There you go. That's Mark's response.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, we're just around about an hour, so I'd like to just draw things to a close. Thank you all very much for the questions. Thank you, Mark, for an excellent presentation. Really interesting.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks for taking the time out to do that. It's very much appreciated. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and hope you'll join us for our next lecture on the 14th of November, where we'll be joined by the National Cyber Security Council, who are going to take us through various support resources that they offer to people. I'd also like to mention our annual conference, which will be held at the East of England Arena in Peterborough on the 1st of November. So we have an excellent range of presenters who are going to be talking about sustainability in agriculture with a particular focus on soil. So please do check out the website and get your place booked, because that's only in a couple of weeks now. So all that's left to say is thanks again for everybody for joining, and see you next time. Bye-bye.